Well, hello folks, David Chandross from the Center for Teaching and Learning here at Humber College with Gamification Report episode 13. This is a special edition in which we're going to address deep learning and emotions in gaming. And we're going to look a little deeper than the kind of stuff you normally hear at community college and universities. We're going to talk about deep learning. And deep learning has a lot of dimensions. So we're going to be looking at serious game enjoyability. We're going to look at neurotensin and mentalizing and empathy. We're going to look at cannabis and learning. And by this, I don't mean smoking weed and learning. We're going to talk about cannabinoid receptors. And they seem to be the receptors that connect emotion to learning and what we know about that. And then we'll talk a little bit about virtual reality and emotions. So let's get going on this. I think you'll find this stuff fascinating. First of all, this is really great stuff, and we're starting to use it in our research. This is the work by Shen Wang and Ritterfield, coming out of 2018, which is serious game enjoyability. And there's a lot of things that we want to know about. What do you like about a game? So if you let someone play a game, and they've got some experience gaming, so they've got a little bit of an understanding of it, they can use Likert scales, which is a scale that you would strike through between 1 and 10. Do you love something or do you hate it, etc. at 0? Or do you love it? You might score a 10. And then also narrative reports in which we ask people about games. So they would take game by game and do this very detailed work with people playing them to find out what made games useful and helpful. And these are the most important questions we need to ask when we're designing what we call deep games, games that have a high narrative structure and that will take us through a lot of learning through an entire organization like a major bank or college program. So let's get started with looking at some of the analysis. The game title, America's Army, the player that he had 10 years of experience playing. Now, America's Army was a free game that was produced by the U.S. Army, and it was this engaging open world combat experience. And so they asked in the Likert and written responses, why was it fun? What was it not fun? And then Ritterfield had developed 27 different fun factors that he begins to scan for as they look at games. So let's look at the sample data and high enjoyability rank. Here is games that had really high enjoyability across users. And so therefore he gave this an enjoyability index of 100. And an example of this game was both BioShock and Counter-Strike. If you're a gamer at all, you know these games well. If you're not, these are really, really creative games that had high penetration into the market and just millions of players enjoying them. So why was it that this game got an index of 100? Well, it had an original design. The controls were very simple to operate. Whoops, we just step back into this. And we better go forward again. I almost want to start again, but we won't. We had original design. The controls are very simple. There, I blew it on controls. Geez, the controls aren't so good in this Apple. It was non-linear with many levels, so that you could engage in the game in many different places. You didn't have to do one thing and then the other. You weren't scripted. It has sophisticated AI. In games like BioShock, you've got things that attack you in the game that have artificial intelligence, and they're smart. They don't just sit and shoot and you just blast them. They're hiding behind things and moving around you, and you have to deal with them. There was very challenging, and things that are challenging mean that winning is very gratifying. And they have great graphics and sound as well, with an intricate and deep storyline that didn't really have an end. It was like you were engaged in a world, and this gave us a feeling of high immersion. So BioShock and Counter-Strike, great work on producing a high enjoyability index game. Then they looked at other games, so an enjoyability index of 50 out of 100 was seen in the game Postal 2 and Lord of the Rings. Now, what they said here was that the decent graphics, there were some glitches, you could walk through walls and walk through tables. The controls were average, but they weren't really exciting. It was fun, but it wasn't sustained over time, and there was low immersion. So you had fun with it, but you couldn't keep playing it, and you didn't really feel like you were lost in the game world. Then he looked at games that had an enjoyability index of 0, such as Beachhead and Driver. And the problem here was that the controls were stiff and simple and unnatural. There was no complexity in the game. It had low replayability. It wasn't rewarding to advance to the next level. The sound and graphics were poor, and the game was either too easy or too difficult to play. So how do serious games stack up? Well, the enjoyability score of 60 is seen in a number of serious games they looked at next. So these are games that we use for teaching, and we're really not doing a great job with these yet. So when they looked at this game called Objection, now what Objection is a set of games that ended up with a score of 60 to train lawyers in 3 different areas: criminal, civil, and expert witness. And it was certified by continuing legal educators for credits across U.S., so it's used by a number of law students. So let's deep dive a little bit to see what happens in this serious game. What you basically do when you play Objection is you simulate the role of a defendant's attorney. You've got to judge 20 different prosecutor questions as either proper or as one of 12 objectionable categories. The high score that you get would advance you to the next level where you'd be challenged by your next part of the game. So the average number of attempts to play the game for non-lawyers is about 5 times to advance. So it takes you a while to get this right. Now, the narratives and judges, when we look at it, the narrative is just about judges engaging with you. So people said this was a good game because at a fast pace, it was kind of addictive and rewarding and replayable. You wanted to get it right and kind of play lawyer. But they had very low graphics. But it was interesting, what we've seen in a lot of these studies, that the graphics didn't hold it back on its own. There was a lot of humor built into the game, and players are actually laughing out loud as they're playing. So the element of humor sort of bundled this game to make it very useful. And now let's look at another game that had an enjoyability index of about 50, again, a serious game, and try to see what happened here. Now, 50 is not a very high score, and it's lower than our last one. So this is a game called Remission. Now, Remission is a PC-based health promotion game. And basically, you have a little nanobot that you control as the player, which destroys cancer cells, it battles infections, and manages the side effects of cancer. So the goal is to enable young people to manage the disease and promote a healthy lifestyle. So where did the low enjoyment come from? Why was this game, which sounded like it could be exciting, such a dog? Well, number one, it had lackluster play. And this is a common problem in serious educational games. Some of them are so busy teaching you, they forget about engaging you. The game wasn't fun, so no one wanted to advance. You played the game once, you'd had it. He went through the body to fight cancer cells, a concept that should have been mind-blowing, but all you would do is when you saw cancer cells is hold down a fire button, and then randomly you might kill the cancer or not, so you hope for the best. You had no control in the game. You had identical tunnels, which led to identical enemies acquiring identical-looking power-ups. So what's there to do in a game like this? So what gave it a lower score was patient narratives and patient biographies, ailment descriptions, and sound and voice acting, and overall production quality was good. So that meant it didn't get a 0. So there were some elements of the game that were useful, but as we can see, it didn't reach the higher score. Another serious educational game that he looked at in the study is called electrocardiogram, and it got a score of 40 on the player index. It teaches players 16 years and older how to do an ECG. You can basically role play a medical doctor. And it was interesting that there was no complexity to it. It was a lot of effort to make a decision and relatively easy to play, but there was a lack of complexity which killed the game. And you can imagine a game about reading ECGs where patients came in, and if you read it right and you did the right things in medicine, you might save them, and you might have to do it under pressure. But none of that happened. You just kind of, again, it was this serious game sclerosis, this curriculo-sclerotic thing we see, where serious games are produced by people who really don't much passion or experience in game design, and they're struggling to make it interesting. And so this is where we want to advance the field, which is why you're watching this with us today. Now, let's look at a real dog, like a game that just died, like an enjoyability of 0. And that was a game they reviewed called Darfur is Dying. Now, it's an interesting concept, and it was socially relevant because you're in Darfur in Africa. You're displaced Darfurian, and a patient must negotiate forces that threaten the survival of the family, and you're living in a refugee camp. Your job is to collect water and bring water to the village to create food or building materials. So the village has to survive for 7 days to get through it. So it's kind of an interesting plot, but here's what happens in the game. There was a horrible harsh sound when militia vehicles drive into the camera. So you would suddenly be out trying to collect water, and the militia vehicles come in. Now you're panicking, but the sound just grated on your nerves, and it drove right toward you, and you couldn't really get out of its way. So it was repetitive and awkward. And one player commented, in fact, collecting water was superfluous. I just let my avatar get hit by the truck to advance to another mode. And I've done this too. Sometimes games are so bad you just let them kill you to see at least you can do something different in the game. The village was even worse in this game. Tasks were all the same. They weren't connected to the outcome. You gathered water and you built the house, but it didn't have anything to do. It was simplistic. So when you talk about games that are super fun, we talk about the things we've seen that worked here, which is a good narrative, good character development, good dialogue, good humor, social interaction, sophisticated high-quality presentation, good gameplay structure, complexity, and diversity. In other words, a real passion to build a high-quality game that you're excited about. So I hope that's helpful for you. What we're going to move on next today is look at endocannabinoids and neurotensin a little bit. So I want to look a little bit at some of these factors that we see developing in the nervous system in terms of deep learning. So the basal ganglia and reward-related behaviors are affected by a number of neurotransmitters. One of them is neurotensin, which is a 13 amino acid neurotransmitter. And neurotensin is basically a transmitter that we don't know a lot about in terms of its behavior in learning, but we do know that it decreases in schizophrenia episodes. When schizophrenic have bad episodes, neurotensin levels drop. And neurotensin levels are also very low in people with dementia. with Alzheimer's. So neurotensin seems to have a role in connecting us with learning and emotion. But what is kind of interesting is that there's a number of endocannabinoids that are emerging. This is a paper by Shanna Augustin and David Lovinger in 2018 on endocannabinoid-dependent synaptic plasticity. So what we've learned here is this is an area of the brain, and these are all different parts of the mouse brain that have endocannabinoid receptors. So these are the receptors that marijuana attaches to. But they weren't designed for marijuana. They were designed for what are called endocannabinoids, like anandamides is another name for them, these peptides in the brain. And they have to do with a lot of deep behaviors related to learning. As I said in the beginning of the broadcast, the endocannabinoids seem to connect emotion to learning. So we have goal-directed and habit learning, and these are all areas rich in cannabinoid receptors. We have the sensory processing and visual. We have hippocampal, which has to do with fear, consolidation, and extinction. We have a lot of endocannabinoid receptors in the dorsal and the ventral striatum, which is reward-driven and Pavlovian learning. They also connect to addiction through reward. And sensory processing, spatial learning, emotional learning, and pattern completion. So we can see that these endocannabinoids are located all throughout the brain, and that we're probably releasing a lot of these during engagement of learning. So when we talk about deep learning, we really didn't have the language to talk about this in the past. Similarly, neurotensin, there's different types of receptors, what are called the NTR1, 2, and 3 receptors. Now, only 10% of neurotensin is expressed in the central nervous system, and 85% is in the GI tract. And that's where we first learned about it. It regulates appetite. But the distribution in rat brain is quite interesting, and it doesn't mirror the cannabinoid receptor, but it's quite diverse. So neurotensin is located at the brain, and we learned about it in the gut first, but now we're learning it has these functions. Now, in human studies, there is some evidence that neurotensin in the entorhinal cortex, it might, again, that's just sort of in this area of the brain, right around the hippocampus, it might have something to do with spatial recognition, so that when we're in virtual reality and we make sense of the environment, when that might be neurotensin mediated. Also, neurotensin may have roles in terms of mentalizing and empathy in humans as well. And in schizophrenia, as we said, it has all these different effects, so that neurotensin deficits in the brain might lead to dopamine neurotransmission, so that our ability to kind of put together reality and make sense of the world may be neurotensin dependent. So I want to keep your eyes on endocannabinoids and neurotensin as neurotransmitters, which are involved in, again, this idea of deep learning, of connections of learning and narrative to deeper brain structures. We're next going to look at the work of Caitlin Mills of 2018, and this is kind of a governing topic, that kind of an overview of what we've talked about today. And what she looks at here is very interesting. Why the mind wanders? How do spontaneous thoughts affect us? You know, when you're just sitting and you're not thinking, your mind is still wandering. Even when you're studying something, the mind wanders. So what is it really doing? And so these are what are called spontaneous thoughts, and they have what's called default variability. And what her idea here is that it may support episodic efficiency. So again, to try to untangle some of this language, why doesn't the mind just grind to a halt where we're not doing anything? And why is it haphazard? Why are you thinking about your vacation one minute and what you're having for dinner the next? Well, William James called this mental locomotion over 100 years ago. And there's this default variability hypothesis, is that we have a frequent arising of new mental states that have a heightened variability of content over time, that it may be an adaptive mechanism. So this may enhance episodic memory efficiency through decorrelating individual episodic memories, so that we don't form linear scripts of things that happen in our lives. We get a different point of view, and we can reactivate learning. Now, I don't know how much sense this is making. It's very abstract language, but it's the idea that if you jump away from what you're learning and you kind of let your mind wander, that mind wandering is after looking for new connections and building new connections in the learning, and then it comes back and helps reinforce the material. Whereas if you learn in a linear way of just studying and staying with something, bang, 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 and focusing, that doesn't really happen. So mind wandering becomes an important way to learn. And they talk about it as a way of facilitating the semantic knowledge optimization by providing optimal conditions for what they call interleaved learning. So the idea that in a game you want there to be, and this is what we do in open worlds, you want there to be a chance for people to kind of space out, to kind of reflect, to do other things in the world, to not just follow a little linear game where you get this and then you do this, that kind of linear development. This is why we're so interested in open worlds, because you want to think and have different perspectives on the material and kind of mind wander in that kind of limited state. They talk about this idea of pattern separation, and this is the process through which distinct representations of episodic experiences and their contextual properties are indexed in the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex, which has inputs into the dentate gyrus here. So here is the entorhinal cortex, and so you have these association areas in the brain. And what we have here is the fornix. This is where we do all of our memory consolidation. And these are the areas of the brain where spatial and object information are processed. So we're putting a lot of material together. I mean, remember we were talking about neurotensin and how neurotensin helped us put spatial information and how to empathize and connect to learning and knowledge, and how endocannabinoid receptors are connecting learning to emotion, and how mind wandering kind of connects to these binding events to form these associations, to form understanding. It's one thing to say how many fingers you have in your hand, but to understand what a hand is, what a hand does, and what a hand means, these are deeper, what we call deep learning, deeper contextual. So semantic knowledge is then our transformation of fragmented episodic experiences into a meaningful understanding of the world, where we have content variability in a series of samples. So we learn about the world not by saying this is a hand and what it does, but by experiencing the hand in many different ways. A hand holding a weapon, a hand being used for tools, a hand being operated on for surgery. The idea of hand takes on this semantic knowledge and these representational structures because of deep learning, because the mind is kind of assembling knowledge that it has in a nonlinear way, and that's what mind wandering seems to do for us. It allows us to extract regularities and generalize across them. In other words, our spontaneous thought's default variability plays a critical role in optimizing efficient abstraction of semantic memory. Very interesting stuff here. It's this idea about noise and variability in attractor networks, that these are non-deterministic, so that we become creative and we solve problems when we see a problem from different points of view. We cannot get that in a linear expositional analysis. And that's something we're going to come back to again by looking at First Nations and Indigenous education, that First Nations peoples generally don't learn in a linear way. They learn by connecting things to nature and by connecting things to the bigger picture. We often use an Aristotelian, what we would almost call a kind of logical positivist view of knowledge, that we move one at a time and we accumulate knowledge like you're learning math, basic skills, and then scaffolding those skills. But this is the idea of attractor networks rather than scaffolding. If this is difficult stuff to look at the work of deep gaming. But what we want to sense here, the sense we want you to leave with, is that strong games make the mind wander. So you can evoke exploration. Imagine you're in open world discovering Aztec civilizations and exploring in the jungle and understanding how this connects to modernity and how this connects to simple primitive technologies. So a linear game, which is the kind of games we tend to produce for learning, are simple simulation scripts, do this, do that. Open game engines encourage wandering, creativity, and novel solutions. I think this is fascinating stuff, and I hope today we've taken you into a world of creativity and understanding that you haven't seen before. We'll see you on the next podcast. David Chandross, Center for Teaching and Learning at Humber College. Have a great wandering week.